You're listening to a Rock Candy podcast.
Hi, my name is Stephen Long, and I host a show here on Rock Candy called Sacred Tension. It's about the spiritual discipline of asking questions. If you find yourself uncomfortable in your faith, or if you find yourself caught between modern science and ancient religion, or if you're curious about the journeys of others who are sorting out faith and doubt, Sacred Tension is a place where nothing is off limits. You will find conversations with pastors, cult experts, spiritual leaders, and skeptics, all discussing the ways we navigate the faiths we were given. Find Sacred Tension right here on Rock Candy and wherever you listen to podcasts.
Welcome to the Eleventylife podcast.
What's up, unicorns? Welcome to this week's episode of Eleventylife. I could not be happier that you are here. It has been a crazy week here at the Rock Candy Recording Studios in beautiful Western North Carolina. Full disclosure, I am so excited about today's episode. I had to watch some ad material from the ASPCA to calm myself down. First off, huge hugs and high fives to everybody over at the Eleventylife Facebook group and Discord server. There are going to be a lot of different things that are talked about in today's episode that I'm sure that some of you are going to want to discuss further or have questions about. Please feel free to do that with the wonderful, beautiful, and kind people over on the Eleventylife Discord. For those of you who are brand new to the show and might not know what the hell is going on, my name is Matt. I'm a producer and songwriter here in Asheville, North Carolina. I grew up in the heavily religious and conservative South. I started a band when I was a teenager called Eleventyseven, and we were a part of the early 2000s Christian rock world. Most of my teens and 20s were spent making records, touring all over the US and all over the world, going to different churches and youth groups and Christian festivals. I grew up an incredibly dedicated and fervent follower of Christ. I was a devout youth group kid, and the one thing that I wanted more than anything else in my youth was to be a part of a Christian rock band, touring the country, spreading the love of Christ to everyone around me. Now, within my band and my personal life, I had a lot of different experiences that shaped my view and my understanding of Christianity, particularly American Christianity, that ultimately led to my exit of that faith entirely. The music that I've created throughout the years has been a chronicling of this exit from organized religion, from Christianity, and a sort of diary into my experience becoming an adult, having my beliefs about love and religion and life and consciousness evolve. And my musical career as Eleventyseven, I hope, has been an accurate reflection of what that journey has been like, both musically and intellectually. Now, as a result of us being so public about our faith, about our journey out of faith, a lot of the things that end up being discussed on the podcast center around those topics. And as a result of that, the most recent 10 years of my life have brought an influx of letters and messages from people who have gone through a lot of the same things, people who are questioning their faith, their religion, belief systems that they were born into or were brought up in. And I personally find these conversations to be incredibly cathartic, regardless of how challenging or difficult they may feel in the moment. So I thought it was really fortuitous as I was preparing for today's episode that the last week leading up to having this interview with Dr. Leah Payne, who I cannot wait to introduce you to, brought with it an email from a listener of our band who is, like so many other people in our generation, experiencing their own exit from a faith situation. They're a person who spent a ton of their life involved in the church and now are finding themselves at an impasse in which they are exiting this institution under incredibly stressful and painful circumstances for them. I'm not going to share any personal details about the listener who wrote the message, but I do feel like in light of what gets talked about in today's episode, it would be a cool thing to share, because I tend to get messages like this on a weekly basis, and a lot of times I find myself wanting to have a piece of material that I can point people to as a conversation starter, or at least an intro to a much more broad and nuanced conversation about what it feels like whenever people are exiting religion and some of the questions that they have concerning that. I want to be very clear that this is just my personal experience and these are just my personal answers to these questions, to these prompts. I am absolutely in no way an authority on anything other than my own lived experience. And I find that when other people are candid and vulnerable about their own personal experiences concerning their exit from organized religion, I find it incredibly cathartic and helpful for me processing my own emotions. So I thought I would share this right here at the top of the episode. It will not take very long. And these are not extensive, exhaustive answers by any stretch of the imagination. But in an effort to be transparent about my own life and my own beliefs and my own journey, I think that this could be incredibly helpful. So this particular listener asked, what kind of church trauma is it that you've endured, and that it's not necessary to go into explicit detail, and they respect privacy? Wonderful, just wonderful, kind-hearted person. My response to that, it would be, in addition to my own experiences in church, we toured extensively in churches all over the U.S. Did not take long for patterns to emerge in the things that we saw. For instance, we would play a youth group somewhere, and upon our return a year later, the youth pastor had been charged with sexual assault or was involved in a scandal, obviously involving underage kids. This happened so often that we assumed we would never see the same youth pastor twice at a church. And it sort of became a running joke within our van. The persistent push for kids to accept a Christian worldview via heavily regulated and enforced conformity and not to enter into a greater truth about the nature of reality via intellectual inquiry was incredibly alarming to us. Within my own experience in church, the world was presented to me in a very polarized way. It was very us versus them. It was very, righteous and unrighteous. Everything that did not have the sanction of the church or of some sort of religious authority on it was somehow dangerous or faulty. And not just that, but it was all seen as threatening. So I think a lot of the trauma that I experienced was because of the disparity between the promise of a life of freedom and joy that was dangled in front of me as a carrot, as a reward for conforming to these beliefs and these behaviors. And it wasn't apparent to me until there were very obvious signs of mental unrest, of mental health issues within my own life that could not be fixed or eased by simple devotion to a deity or to a practice. It became really evident to me that growth and change was necessary and that those needed to take place outside of the religion that I was brought up in. The second question that they asked was, how has this church trauma affected your faith/walk? And most of the time, I feel like when people are referring to a faith or a walk, they're speaking specifically about their experience in Protestant evangelicalism. This is basically just very warm language for how is your devotion to the cause going? And for me, it was a moving target of self-hatred and self-improvement with no verifiable goal in mind other than piety or acceptance within a social group of believers. I was a diehard believer for most of my life, and following that path so rigorously and so fervently was ultimately what I believe led to my exit of Christianity. I found that I couldn't be a part of a system that rewarded cognitive dissonance and reframed my human experience and the miracle of consciousness to be something fought against at every turn instead of accepted and loved and embraced for all of its beauty and complexities and weirdness and strangeness. They go on to ask, what aspects of your faith have changed because of the trauma, and what do you think about faith or church in general now? I'm not sure that I have any blanket statements that I necessarily want to make about church. I think that I can't imagine ever being a part of a church at this point. I have a beautiful community of people and friends and family that all satisfy my need for connection and collaboration and love. The more time that I've spent with this, the more it's become clear to me that the history of church in America is at the very least a long and complicated one that upon scrutiny is incredibly problematic and has had far-reaching adverse impacts on how we view politics and civil responsibility and ourselves as a species. So I have zero judgment on people that want to be a part of these faith communities. But that was one of the arguments that was made to me as I sort of exited church. People would sort of come to me with this gotcha question of, hey, well, like, where do you get your community and where do you get your morals and where do you find stability in your life? All of those things, every single one of them exists outside of church. They exist in the real world. There's something that we as humans naturally do. If we're not following one guiding myth, we will replace it with a different one. For instance, the music that I create is something that I believe in, that I love, that I pour myself and my time and attention into. If somebody were to come up to me, as they have many times in the past, even close friends of mine, and say, I absolutely hate your music. It's not awesome. It puts me in a weird mood. I don't resonate with it. That doesn't in any way affect my friendship. Everyone is entitled to have their own preferences, and everyone has come to those preferences quite honestly. What I experienced in the church was almost a complete turning of the back. Like once you decide that you don't believe these certain tenets of faith, all of a sudden there's an excommunication of that group of people that happens. The exit can feel emotionally violent in so many ways. People that you had all of these wonderful, beautiful experiences with, that you had so much life and so many pivotal milestones happen with, suddenly they view you as a lesser than, as something that is to be kept at an arm's length, or that is not to be embraced in the same way. And my heart goes out to anybody who has ever experienced that emotional void and that feeling of abandonment, when you feel like intellectually you have come to a place where you simply cannot adhere to a belief that somebody else decides is true, that your life experience and your very heart knows that any adherence to that belief system or that view of the world would be performative at best, that there's nothing that you can do to go back and make your belief in this thing genuine anymore. It's one of the most scary and beautiful things that I've ever experienced in my life. And for everybody that might be going through that, gosh, I just want to send you a little e-hug right now, because that's a difficult place to be regardless of where you land on that topic. So they ask, why do you think that quote unquote worldly people are more accepting and kind than those who are within church? And I feel like this is a question that I struggled with so much when I was on the inside of Christianity. That's another one of those cognitive dissonances. If we are supposed to be the light of the world and the salt of the earth, as the Bible would say, why are there so many wonderful, beautiful, more accepting, more empathetic people out there? I believe the distinction between, quote unquote, worldly people and believers is an actual false binary that's been used to color and degrade our understandings of healthy empathy for our species. There's essentially no such thing. It's a made-up concept to call something, an us and a them. The Bible even speaks of the gospel being for Jew and Gentile alike, and Jesus's actual teachings are oftentimes inviting people to a higher understanding of what it means to be conscious and live in true freedom from societal expectation and religious dogma. I think it's important to remember and to reframe that, there was no such thing as Christianity when Jesus walked the earth. He was unashamedly Jewish, and Christianity is a collective and guiding myth built around the historical figure of Jesus and pre-existing Jewish sacred texts. There is kindness to be found in almost everyone that you encounter. If I had never been born into a faith community, I still feel like I would understand the importance of kindness. I would still find it important to grow and develop the love that I have for my fellow friends and fellow man. I would still have questions about standards for morality in the same way that humans did for millennia before the introduction of Christianity. I think sometimes we forget that we as a species have been around for so long, and that Christianity really is this small, tiny blip in the history of us as conscious beings. I think we can all benefit from some zoom out and some candor about the subject. The last thing that they ask is if I still consider myself a believer or a Christian post-trauma, and how do I define it? I am not a believer in Christian dogma. That is to say, I am not in adherence to a set of beliefs that I could easily call myself a Christian. I think it is a shared myth, as I was saying, that we can choose to believe in or not be a part of, just like money, just like the legal system. They're all shared myths and they all work. based off the assumption that we will all go along with it. I think the narrative of Christ is a beautiful one that so many people find solace and hope in, and that generations have. Just like Dionysus, Sol Invictus, Osiris, and Adonis before him, there is something compelling about the myth of the Christ figure, and there's something mysterious about it. It has been said that the idea of God is simply a blanket we throw over the mystery to give it shape, and I can't think of a more magnanimous definition of religious exploration than that. Now, these are all abridged answers to a much more nuanced conversation, but I hope in some way that maybe it was helpful to somebody. The only way that I was able to find a freedom from Christianity was by these kinds of conversations that happened around it. I hope that anyone that finds themselves a part of a faith tradition can extend to themselves the grace of allowing it to grow, allowing it to transform, allowing it to morph. If an idea is not working for you anymore, if you find something to be toxic, it's okay to leave it. It's okay for your understanding of things to grow and develop and bloom in the same way that every single living thing on the planet does that. Everything comes in cycles. Don't deny yourself a springtime of reasoning or a fall or a winter of reasoning. Anyway, I hope that was helpful for somebody. I will shut up about it because today we have an amazing episode with the lovely and talented Dr. Leah Payne. She is a co-host of the podcast Rock That Doesn't Roll, which is essentially a deep dive into the subculture of Christian rock in America. And of course, my ears were like tingling from the very first episode that I heard from them. Because as problematic as a lot of my experience within Christianity was, there was something about this youth group culture that I still have so many beautiful, wonderful memories about. And I had some of the most fun I've ever had in my entire life. I still have so many fond memories of a lot of these bands and a lot of these songs and a lot of the camaraderie that I felt as a pent-up, angsty teen, sweating like a fucking farm animal alongside my fellow Christian teen brethren. Now, Leah just published a book called God Gave Rock and Roll to You, which is an expose of sorts on American Protestant messaging and belief and how Christian rock became a vehicle for propagating these messages. She's done such an amazing job of facilitating a grown-up conversation about what was happening in the messaging of Christian music while we were all youth group kids before that and after. If you find yourself enjoying this conversation and the things that we are talking about, please feel free to click a link in the show notes that will be provided to you to check out her podcast with the wonderful Andrew Gill and the new book that she has out. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Leah Payne.
Sorry. Did I startle you?
Oh my God. I'm so easily startled. Yeah, that scared the shit out of me.
You know what? I tell you what, I've learned so many things in the last couple of years about recording that I never thought or really wanted to know. But anyway, let's see. What am I doing? This is the microphone I have.
Sure.
Okay. And it's plugged in. Let me just try this. Okay. Let me try that again. Okay.
So 1, 2, 3.
Did that work?
I don't know if I heard your clap, but it's fine.
I tried to do it. It could just be that my rhythm is bad. So I write about music. I'm not a percussionist.
There's no way that your rhythm is terrible after all of the writing that you've done about rock and roll.
Oh gosh, that's so crazy.
Okay, so I am so excited about having this conversation with you. And first of all, thank you so much for agreeing to be on the show and to talk about this stuff. I have an extensive amount of experience within the Christian music world. And I always love hearing what everybody else saw, because I feel like it was such an insular experience, and we were like a band that was just kind of within the machine, and slowly like cracks started to show. Like the more touring that we did, the more that we kind of understood like, oh, we're a part of like a message that is like that is unhealthy for not just people, but specifically like impressionable teenagers who were like looking to us for answers, and we're like, we don't know what the hell we're doing here either.
Can I ask? I so appreciate what you're saying. You're definitely not the only person who I've heard say that. How old were you when you were first? I should ask, how old were you when you first started touring? Do you remember?
It would have been between 18 and 19.
Oh,
which is
so
like
very young.
I know.
Very young.
Crazy to think about now, because like I have a daughter who's 17, and I'm like, I can't imagine her like having any sort of wherewithal to put together like a tour and then go do it and interface with adults constantly and then other people. Like, it just feels like a totally different time to be alive than when we were kids.
And also to be an example of like life and godliness to young youth group kids. That's an awful lot to put on a very young person.
Yes, absolutely. So I do have some questions prepared, and I think we can just use them as a guideline to just stay on track, because I don't want to waste your time. But I also, just from listening to your podcast and stuff, I'm like, oh my God, we could blow through several bottles of wine. Just swapping stories.
I love that.
Yeah. First of all, congrats on your book.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a brand new thing. It was just birthed into the world. What, today?
Yes, yesterday was February 1st was the official release day. So because of Amazon, a lot of people got it early.
Nice.
But yes. Yeah. Yay. Happy birthday, book.
Yeah. How does that feel to kind of have it out in the world now after all this prep and all this work that you put into it?
Oh gosh. Somebody asked me that, and I made the mistake of answering honestly, which was like, I was feeling really anxious about it. Yeah. And they were like, oh, I'm not used to people saying that. So, I think I was trying to think, why do I feel anxious? I think it's because I understand that the world of contemporary Christian music was so powerful and so meaningful to people. And I felt a really strong burden to take into account a wide variety of experiences with it and to try and represent those faithfully. And so I think I do feel nervous about it, because I felt like, I'm a professor, and a lot of things that scholars write about are not of general interest. Like they're kind of these really obscure things, but this isn't one of those.
It's like publishing bait.
Yeah. And so this is something and I'm happy about this. That's why I chose the topic. I wanted something that more broad audiences would be interested in, so that we could think together about how music and media shape the religious experiences of people. Yeah. But because of that, it's like, I've gotten along the way, I got a lot of unsolicited feedback, input, advice. I got a lot of solicited feedback and input as well. But so it feels kind of, I don't know. I'm glad to be talking with you. You're somebody who has a lot of experience with the very world that I'm talking about in the book. So that's
absolutely.
really exciting.
So first of all, just a quick plug for your podcast, Rock That Doesn't Roll, with
thank you,
Andrew Gill. You guys have such a great dynamic. Everything is so slick. It's so polished, and it's just inviting enough to where it's like, oh yeah, everything. It's just so well thought out. And as somebody that does podcasting and has helped other people develop podcasts, the level of quality and attention to detail that I heard in yours did not go unnoticed. I have to say that I need to credit Andrew Gill for that.
So I wrote a book about contemporary Christian music, and he has so much insight and had such a great year. Since you brought up the sonic experience, I just have to give all of that credit to Andrew. He did a great job of finding. We were trying to create something where, we couldn't put the smells of it over the internet, but we were trying to come up with like the sounds of what it would feel like to be in a really specific world that if you're in it, it's everything. And if you're outside of it, you might not totally understand. So I just have to say, Andrew's the best. And thank you so much. I'm really glad, I think I speak for both of us that it's a real thrill to know that it resonated with people.
Yes.
So
yeah, excellent. I do feel like as I was listening to it, now that you say that, I did smell a little bit of Christian bookstore shelving in the background.
Wait a minute. Oh, yep. That's potpourri. That's anointing oil.
Yeah, that's it.
That's so funny.
Oh, they're trying out new anointing oil in the back. Oh, that's great.
I can smell it.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit more about what was your life experience that you sort of brought to this book? What is your origin story in terms of faith? Did you grow up in the church?
Sure.
Is this something that's like kind of written into your bodily experience on planet Earth or what?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. I grew up in a Foursquare church in rural Oregon. I mentioned that my dad was a Pentecostal pastor, and I grew up with a particular style of music known as Jesus music. And if you know what that is, and you know what that is, if you don't, it's the music of the hippieized Christians that grew kind of disillusioned with the counterculture norms and had these really radical conversion experiences. So I was raised in a church that was really formed by that. So people like Keith Green and Second Chapter of Acts and Randy Stonehill and Larry Norman and Honey Tree, I could go on and on and on. That was the kind of music that was central to my upbringing. And then eventually Pentecostal and charismatic praise and worship music. So like Vineyard music and stuff like that. So my dad did not like contemporary Christian music, and I need to ask him why, but he would just always say like, it's not good, so he didn't play it in our house. So while a lot of kids were raised with contemporary Christian music being offered as, and I talk about this a lot in the book, being offered as a kind of parallel, safe Christian alternative to whatever was happening in mainstream culture.
Right.
I wasn't really raised with that, but I was raised around it, so every kid I knew, like in youth group and stuff like that, most of them were raised in those kinds of homes. So I definitely understood how that world functioned, even if it wasn't something that my parents imported into our household. And it's kind of funny. It's like, I don't know why, really, they didn't see that was an option. But were you raised within the world of contemporary Christian music? Like, given particular music, you can listen to this, you can't listen to this.
Yeah. It was worse than that for me. Like my personal experience was like the first church that I remember going to, I think was like an independent fundamental Baptist sort of thing. So it was very, very strict. And as I sort of came of age and started becoming a teenager, getting into music and discovering all of these different sounds and artists and everything, I had been brought up in such an us versus them world that it all just seemed overwhelming. And it all, like anytime that I didn't know what to think or feel about something, I just immediately assumed somehow Christ would not approve of it. Because I just had this body knowledge of like, oh, I don't understand it. So this must be God telling me to shove it away, or that, it could bring out some sinful nature part of myself that I'm not prepared to deal with. So it was sad. Like childhood was kind of sad.
Oh gosh. Wait, I have so many follow-up questions. So were you, because you became a musician, most people that were raised in Christian communities that I know were taught music in the church. So was that the case with you? What kind of music was formative for you?
It was like hymnals, Disney movies, video game music, because we could play Mario or Sonic or whatever.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And so there was a lot of that, which now, all the music that I make kind of is an amalgamation of all of that stuff.
That's so fun.
Yeah.
I love that. Yeah.
But it was like when I started getting turned, I remember a kid came to school one day and he's like, bro, you got to check this out. Like, I heard that you were a Christian. And like, because I heard our moms talking that you like to go to church, and he was
gosh.
Yeah. I have these CDs that I don't really listen to anymore, but I think you might dig it. And I was like, okay. And he brought a Petra CD to school.
Very nice.
And,
very nice.
Yeah.
Do you remember what album?
It was something rock on it. It was like,
yeah.
I just remember like it seemed very quintessentially like 80s, early 90s possibly.
Yes.
And I hated it. And I thought it was terrible. But like I started I started like connecting with other kids at church, and they were like, or going to youth camps. And at youth camps, there would always be a camp counselor that had this gigantic CD wallet that was just a treasure trove of like this whole other side of Christendom that I had not been exposed to. And I was like, well, these guys are doing it. Like, it must be safe. It must be okay. So that was where it was like MXPX, the Supertones, all of the tooth and nail shit, all of that I just found so compelling and cool and just dove right into it. Now, when I would bring these back home, or I would like save up my money, I would want to go to like the Christian bookstore to
Christian
like,
bookstore?
purchase
Yes, great. Yeah.
My parents would put limits on what I could purchase or not purchase. Like, I remember like finding some CD from a rock band, and my dad was in the store with me, and he was like, I told him that this is the CD that I wanted to purchase. I was maybe like 13 or 14 at the time. And he turns the CD over, he looks at it just with this like weird sort of judgment in his eyes about everything that he's seeing. And he was like, Matt, do these people look like they love the Lord?
Wow.
And I was like, I don't even know how to interface with that conversation.
Right.
Because I was like, the guy that's telling me this looks angry all the fucking time. So I was like, well, by your own standards, I'm not sure if you. So yeah, exactly. So it was a whole lot of that. It was just oppressive and strange and demure, and everything just felt muted. And these weird little subsects of Christian rock, like these weird little things that were happening with Tooth and Nail, or sometimes Forefront, or these other labels, were kind of like the one outlet that I was like, okay, well, but I am a Christian, and even if my parents don't get this, maybe I can be more progressive in thought, and I can enjoy these things because they're still safe.
Right.
And the older that now as an adult, I'm like, I'm not sure if any of that is quote unquote safe, but it's also harmless. if you know what I mean? It's also fine, but nobody wanted to have a conversation. They didn't know why they hated it. They couldn't articulate why they felt like it was wrong or bad in a way that made sense to me as a teenager. And now the conversations that I have with people are, hey, but the messaging in this propagates these really, really toxic ideologies within Christianity and within culture at large. And they're all playing a huge part in denying youth the right to grow up in a world where everything doesn't have to be us versus them, right and wrong. There's an entire grayscape that opens up to you in the world when we don't have these like really fundamentalist beliefs about what's right, and when we're not eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, I guess, as it were, for anybody who's a Christian that's listening. It's
interesting. It's interesting. I love hearing those kind of stories because I know there were kind of several different types of young people who found in Christian rock a place of meaning and identity, and some folks who I write about were raised in congregations that sound a lot like the types of community that was formative for you and for your parents, where there was antipathy toward rock just generally, and Christian rock. I don't know if your parents were ever into, there was kind of like a class of media experts, self-educated, self-proclaimed media experts, right? People like Bill Gothard. He's kind of maybe one of the better known ones, especially lately, because there's been a lot of abuse scandal related to him.
Whole lot of James Dobson.
Well, and Dobson did, but Dobson, I think, was more insightful about the potential of rock music. So whereas Gothard was like, no. Right. The rock beat is going to make young teens want to have sex, and it's going to, and he would get really, really into like kind of like a pseudoscientific diagnosis of the music. And I trace the history. There's a long history that is really embedded within like conversations like about race and racism in the United States, about rock, like why it sounds the way it does. And anyway, I don't want to get into that too much, but Dobson, I think, had the greater insight, which is that if you embrace a certain form of it, it's very powerful. Sure. So the Dobson organization regularly partnered with Christian rock acts as a way of importing their messaging. And it's kind of funny because there's like different approaches. You can say, no, absolutely not. But it's more powerful to say yes and then put whatever, like there's a quote that I used in the book where Billy Graham talks about DC Talk, and he is praying over them, and he says he's thanking God for these tools of evangelism. And I think that's like the perfect way of understanding how a certain set of parental evangelical figures came to see Christian rock as like, this is how we're going to train up children in the Christian life, which if you think about it is kind of a new idea, like the idea that you would use mass media to do this. Like traditionally you baptize, you do like some sort of catechesis where you like, show that you understand a certain kind of set of doctrines. You do like it. But instead it's like all the things that you said, like Christian movies, Christian TV, Christian music. And it's fascinating to be kind of on the, it's fascinating to give that idea a little bit of distance. So now we're several decades in, and we can be like, oh, well, how did that work? What are the results? And I think like statistically, I think we could say it's mixed. Like for every you, there's probably like, a couple for every, you, there's maybe 2 or 3 that are still in it. Really, but that's not like great stats in terms of, if you want, the promise was, this is going to keep all your kids in church. We're gonna, and I don't know that it worked to the degree that people were hoping it would work, because I bet your parents, it sounds like they really wanted you to follow in their footsteps, to stay in this particular community. I don't know, I don't want you, don't feel like you need to answer this if it's too personal, but how did that change over time? Are they still like, absolutely not? Did they kind of change, because you became a musician? How was that?
I don't think they've had a choice. And to their credit, I always think that people have the ability to change, to take in new information, which is why I get excited about things like your book.
Oh, thanks.
It's important to take in new information and develop a worldview based off of that. But this whole idea that we grew up with was, this is the worldview and this is everything that we fit. No matter what's happening in the world, this is our rock, and we filter it all through this lens or else. And the stakes were that high. I think that it's still... I remember my mom, I came home and I told my mom that we had been talking to the guys in this band that we listened to called Audio Adrenaline. And at the time, they were like one of the hugest, Christian rock stars or whatever.
Absolutely.
It feels gross in my mouth to say Christian rock star now.
They were, though. They were big Christian
absolutely.
Rock stars.
Huge deal. And really nice guys.
Oh, the nicest. Yeah. I have met them. Yes. Go ahead.
So I was like, hey, these guys are offering us a record deal, and they're talking about, us being able to tour and maybe putting off college for a little while. And I think maybe this is the path that I want to take. And this is after my parents, when I told my parents I was interested in music and I wanted to be in a band, I wanted to do songwriting and performance and all this stuff. And my mom's response was, well, maybe we can make some phone calls and see if you can run sound. For there was no belief on my parents' end in what I wanted to pursue or my ability to do any of this. So it was crazy. So I think at every turn it was just, I felt like if I wasn't supported in something, I had to do it to prove to myself that I don't know, that I had other muscles to develop. That wasn't at the behest or the whims of adults or authority figures in my life, especially being in the church.
Well, in your own way, that's pretty rock and roll, right? It's about self-definition, rebelling against your parents.
Yes, because I was staying very pure throughout all of this still, even in my... And it was just everything that I did, if it was in opposition or if it was just challenging a thought, it was always my parents would always come down on me and be like, you are rebelling. And this is the same rhetoric that you can still see in these sermons and stuff in these different, subsects of Christianity, where it's no, this is literally just intellectual inquiry. This is something that a human brain does naturally, regardless of their personality a lot of times. But it was just stomped and squashed at every turn. And it was you must be rebellious. You must want something out of life that you're not finding in God or you're not finding in the right way. And it sucked. It was just awful.
Are they still, I mean, you said independent. What denomination?
So that was like the first.
Baptist.
Yeah, so that was like the first church that I was in.
Yeah,
As I became a teenager, and there's always a mix up in church. If you're in the South, you probably go through 5 or 6 churches in your lifetime.
Right.
So I was fortunate enough to kind of like come out of that, and we went to started going to a progressive church, and that was when I started meeting some other guys who, we would go to camp together, and we would play these songs, and played in the worship band together, and then ultimately, it was like, oh, okay, well, worship music kind of sucks. So why don't we just start covering some MXPX songs on the weekend? Like have a little band rehearsal or whatever.
Yeah.
And then it just turned into a thing.
Oh, so like you found your people, as they say, as the kids say. That's really neat. It's interesting. Your personal trajectory is, I think, representative of a lot of people's experiences, and really like the way that people are worshiping, how that's changing, which is to say that, in the earlier days of contemporary Christian music, denominational identity was kind of like how they talk about people have sort of hierarchies of identity, like how do you think of the thing that makes you you? And in another generation, your status as a Baptist would be kind of important, like a fairly important signifier, especially in the South, like of who you are. I only know that because I moved to the South, and then I realized like people didn't ask me, are you religious? Which no one would really even ask in Oregon. I'm from Oregon, and my own dad, a pastor, told me it was rude to ask people about religion and politics because it's just like a really secular, part of the country.
That's his bread and butter. What's going on?
I know. Well, it just goes to show, like, it's a very different culture. And then when I moved to the South, when I lived in Nashville, I was like, one of the bigger culture shocks was when people ask you, they don't ask you, are you religious? They ask you where you go to church. They just take for granted that you're a Christian, that,
Yeah.
in their minds it's Protestant too. But anyhow, so like this idea that you'd be like Baptist and then move into what I imagine is more of like a non-denom kind of feel with like a rock band.
Yeah.
That was happening all over the country. And it's only, I think even things like COVID have only heightened that, where people are worshiping less often in larger like mega church settings, that they're increasingly non-denominational, and worship music is the kind of music that's well suited to that. It's really interesting. Like the world that created contemporary Christian music, the world that, where you guys were like, we're going to have a band. And I would imagine you start playing at, coffee shops or like other youth groups, and, that kind of world doesn't exist as much anymore. So, I mean, of course there are always Christians making music that will never stop, but that kind of like the industry end of it has really changed. Like the idea that there'd be like a bunch of bands, when I was in my formative years, it's like everybody was trying to make a band, like create a band and like go on youth group tour and all of that kind of stuff. And it's not really as accessible. I mean, you said you have teen kids, like
I have one. I have a daughter.
You have a daughter. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So, if she wanted to like start a Christian band, it'd be harder, than it was. Could be harder to find places to go play.
I would be okay.
I mean, I don't even know if she would, but
no, she doesn't. But there's also like, there's no way of conveying to her like what our church trauma looked like and what we saw over the course of a decade in America, like touring all of these mega churches and being a part of all these festivals and this subculture. And so on the one hand, it's like we poke fun, like that's how we kind of deal with everything. We poke fun at a lot of different like religious beliefs and yada, yada, yada. But we kind of draw this hard line of like, hey, it's very easy to be born into this. It's very easy to be a part of this type of belief system. And there are a lot of people that choose to be a part of it because they find some value in it, because they find some solace or they find some community in that. And that is never okay to judge people for that kind of behavior. Everybody's finding that. It just so happened that we happen to be born in this very distinct subculture. We developed the way that we did. We saw too much. We saw the sausage being made, and it didn't resonate with us.
I would love to hear more of your thoughts on that. Anything you'd like to share, but like when you made reference to like you saw some things. I'm not interested in like dish the dirt, but I just mean like what are kind of the overarching themes that caused you to think, I don't know if this is what I want to be a part of.
Yeah. I mean, I think there was like so much of that. We didn't understand how the music industry worked, and we certainly didn't understand the commodification of faith and what that looks like in a market, what that looked like in the context of America, and what types of religious beliefs America was exporting to other countries, because we were on the inside of it and we couldn't see any perspective. The more that we kind of got out and started touring, like I remember when we were making our first record, it was the first time we had the record almost done. And then, we talked to some of the Audio Adrenaline guys, and they were like, hey, so we're friends with this producer guy that we want to hook you guys up with. He's a really great songwriter, and we're looking for a really specific kind of single that we can service to Christian radio. And everybody goes through that. This is your trial by fire. You're either going to be indignant and throw away the gold offered to you, or you're going to take it and see what happens. So we did. And I have so many conflicting thoughts about it, because on the one hand, I'm like, this guy that we got paired with, amazing songwriter. So on the one hand, there was an artistry that I wish that my heart had been more open to, that I had more maturity in understanding what that situation was, because I love songwriting now. I've taught songwriting in college. So it's like, there's so many things I could have learned in that experience if I hadn't been in my head about it. But I was so overwhelmingly disappointed by this idea that when we got in there, all we talked about was, well, this is what like the typical soccer mom is going to want to listen to, and not just something that she's going to be okay listening to, something that she'd be willing to open her pocketbook for. And it needs to straddle this line between something that she could listen to with her friends passively, and also something that she feels like her kids won't think she's lame for. And it was like the songwriting sessions were more just like marketing meetings, and it almost felt like this Big Brother-esque type thing where I'm like, wait, you have this dialed in. Like, the point is not to create the best art that we can. It's to create the minimum viable product that most soccer moms would want to consume. And I felt like that was a strange form of objectification that I didn't quite understand at the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you're 19 or 20 or however old you were, like how on earth? I really developed a lot of empathy for a lot of the artists. Like, someone asked me, like, these artists, they're just in it for the money. And I was like, well, that would be silly. You could make more money being an accountant. Like,
doing
there's not
anything.
Like the vast majority of people. I mean, Amy Grant made a lot of money, but she was wealthy before she became a musician. Like, she's just from a wealthy family. Like, so by and large, most musicians were not making a ton of money. So they're not in it for the money at all. They're in it for the love of something, like there are a lot of different reasons. I think some bands, I argue in the book that the bands that were the most successful were the bands who saw themselves first as youth pastors. So, like the Audio A guys are the perfect example of that. I met them years ago, and they are absolutely the nicest guys in the world. And I don't think that, especially the original band members, I'm not saying like, I'm talking about the early days. Right. I think that those guys had a real heart for evangelical youth group kids, and were like so sincere about, like serving them. And so there are like bands like that. And I think those were the folks who ended up being the most successful, because exactly what you said, the target buyer, like the target consumer was the evangelical teens, but the target buyer was their moms. And in the book, I talk about, it's a well-known term in the industry. I'm sure you know it. Becky. Becky is the name of the kind of composite marketing figure who, as they got digital marketing kind of underway, they figured out who she was with like incredible detail. Yes. They're targeting these folks. I mean, I think one thing that's interesting, like your experiences, I think were part of what ultimately undermined contemporary Christian music as a genre, because it was always very parental, like the business end of it, right? It's like, in fact, one of the most influential figures in the history of contemporary Christian music is a guy named Billy Ray Hearn, who created Sparrow Records, who signed all these like Keith Green and all that those folks. And Sparrow was one of the bigger record labels for a long time. And eventually all of these folks, of course, get consolidated and now they're owned by non-religious corporations. But Billy Ray Hearn was a Southern Baptist youth pastor before he was an A&R guy. And so like, there's always this idea that we are parenting kids, and the kids themselves just chafed under that, you know? So a lot of times, like if you were the type of person, Petra was like this too. So Petra and Audio Adrenaline, I think, are very similar in this way. They understood the assignment, you know, like we are going to care for youth group kids, and they did it very well. But then there was like this kind of pesky problem of rock and roll and pop music as being like a way of self-definition in like against, usually over and against your parents, you know? So there was always this like tension, and eventually it just, you know, and the internet helped with this too, because good luck censoring your kids' media now, which terrifies me as a parent.
Sure.
Because I'm a parent of very young children. And so you better believe I'm like, it's on lockdown.
Of course.
But you know, when they get older, like I'm not going to be able to censor, you know, what they consume. And I just think that that's, you know, it's a really interesting, like, it's like, I think of it as an experiment. It's like, we're going to do this. We're going to try this. There was a lot of optimism, but your types of experiences were so common where, and there were, I do think it's worth noting that there were people who were sort of resistance thinking all along the way. A couple of people that I identify, and one I used to work for, Charlie Peacock and Steve Taylor, their philosophy of art was different than most contemporary Christian music people. Cause their idea was like, you create good art, it will attract people. And so they create, you know, or they help Switchfoot and Six and the Richer, which were bands that could stand on their own 2 feet in the general market. And also, you know, youth group kids loved them. And it's interesting that they were like a Minority Report, you know, like saying like, okay, we should do it this way. But the overwhelming, like the mechanisms of the industry were so much bigger. And in the end, like it was not sustainable. The business part of it was not sustainable. Their artistry stands on its own, both Steve Taylor and Charlie Peacock. But so much of the business was oriented toward those Beckys. And, you know, I think y'all are, I think, a great example of the unsustainability of it. Because once you start thinking to yourself, like, wait a minute, well, I don't want to be talking to Becky's, right? I'm guessing you wanted to talk to your peers. Well, if I had, right?
Yeah. So the biggest concern with that is thinking like, first of all, there's nothing wrong with developing, you know, a prototype for the person that you're trying to market to. That's just marketing. That's business. That's okay in any market. The thing that we had the issue with, and it's not like, you know, the secular, I don't even want to, just the regular, legit music industry. It has those things too. They're marketing specifically to teens, adults, yada, yada, yada. And it's people's jobs to do that. The issue that we had was this marriage of religion with like, we have the secret. This is what it felt like. We have the secret to the universe. We have the end all be all, the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, the way of salvation, the salvation of mankind, all wrapped up in this message and in this life that we're trying to live in a very specific way. And when you sit us down to have conversations and there's no delineation between what we're doing in our faith and what we're marketing to people, which there wasn't, I was like, my conscience exploded. So that's
really interesting. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. We were always at odds. It always felt like everything that we were being asked to do, we were constantly like fighting against it. And we would find somebody at the label that would really go to bat for us and try to stand up for us and what we were trying to do and have those conversations. And at the end of the day, it was like somebody should have just sat us down and been like, look, this is not for you. This is a square peg in a round hole type situation. If this is not a game that you're willing to play, then don't. But then you also have to think at the same time, we're not wealthy kids. We didn't come from much. This is the first time in our lives we'd ever been handed anything that made us feel special, that set us apart from our peer group, that gave us attention and love and affection and support from all of these people, from people all over the country that we didn't even know. And we could get in a van and go play shows and high five and mosh, with all these people and have all these cool experiences. And we're like, yeah, but are we willing to give that up? And so it was just, it's so complicated. It's not to trauma dump on you. This is supposed to be about you. Jesus Christ.
No. Don't worry about it. That's very, that idea is something that I wanted to parse out, which is the idea that, like, I'll kind of nerd out here, but this idea that you can marry capitalism and Christianity in such a tight way. Like the idea that I note in the book that there are always dissenting people who were like, wait a minute, should we be doing this? There are some very well-known ones like Rich Mullins or Keith Green was known to harp on this as well. He had a lot of things that he was arguing with people about. But anyway, so there are always voices that would say, I'm not sure about this, but the overwhelming majority of people interpreted the prosperity of the industry as a sign of God's favor.
Yes.
And so that is a very powerful argument, and it's a hard one. In fat times, it's a hard one to undermine, because I'm sure the counter argument to your 20-year-old idealistic self would be, well, look at this. You're going to these youth groups and you're seeing these kids, look
how many people
in their minds, they're converting, they're doing all the things because, it's funny. CCM, I've argued that it ushered in a particular kind of evangelicalism to become like the generic term of it.
Yeah.
So the overwhelming majority of people who created contemporary Christian music came from only 3 different groups. Holiness people, so like Nazarenes, Wesleyans, Baptists, like your crew, and then Pentecostals, and then eventually Charismatics. And so those 3 groups, and they were mostly Southern or on the West Coast, they became like the sound of generic evangelicalism. So they're kids in like Minnesota who are learning the ways of being evangelical that actually only like a small group of people, were doing. That sort of blows my mind. But your way of doing that, like you're out there doing, I don't know if you guys did altar calls at any point in time.
We never felt, we were very familiar with them, but they always felt cringy to us. We always did not. We literally had people offer us, like, we will give you $500 more
to do an altar call.
To do an altar call. And it just constantly put us in this situation where we're like, look, as soon as we have this conversation, you're not going to want us here.
Right.
Like, I know how high the stakes are in this moment, but I'm sorry. That is not something that we feel called to do. It's not something that we feel led to. Everything that I learned about, anytime that there's a religious group whose primary goal is conversion, it never ends well in the course of human history. It's not something we want to be a part of, however well-intentioned.
Yeah. I think that because I've talked to so many bands that were like, oh gosh, we hated being asked, to do that moment. But why were you guys being asked to do that? Well, I think that for a certain group of evangelicals, that is the primary sign that things are working.
Yeah.
So for other groups, there'd be so many other ways of counting, like, are we, passing this on to future generations? Are we sustainable? You could measure money, you could measure like membership, but altar calls, that is like evangelical kind of
soul wallet,
like Baptist-y thing. So you can kind of see why people were asking you to do it. And of course, then you can, on the other hand, obviously I don't blame you. I would feel so awkward doing that, in part because, especially when you sail into like an unknown territory, what are you even asking these people to be a part of? You don't know, right? Like, you don't know what the church is like. You don't know what their community is. So there's obviously a lot of reasons why people had a lot of distaste for it. But to me, and I think a lot of people that I talked to were like, they didn't feel comfortable because as musicians, they understood the power of music and they felt that what they were doing was coercion because they understood that in that moment, people are, and I'm like this with music. I'm especially vulnerable when I'm, like a good piece of music, like I'm crying, I'm doing,
I
don't even cry in real life, really. Yeah. So, but when, some song, so I think, obviously big reasons why you wouldn't want to do that. But you can also see on the other side, like this is a tradition, like this is how these groups recognize that God is moving in the world. And they oftentimes do it through these rituals and then also through the market. So the fact that people were buying music, I mean, it was, I can't, I've tried the whole way to put myself in the place of people that I'm writing about in many different kinds. And I like to think that I would be a person of conscience. Like there's a character who I write about. He's a real person. His name is John Fisher.
A real character.
There's a figure that I write about, who the editors of CCM magazine gave him the last word at the end of Contemporary Christian Music magazine issues for many years. And he was this kind of unusually insightful figure who would, one of my favorite op-eds that or like little essays that he puts in the back that I quote in the book is from an article. I think the title of it is When Christianity Pays. So he starts off by saying, when Christianity costs you something, Christianity flourishes. And so he talks about persecution and like the idea that you would have to like sacrifice some part of yourself.
Yes.
That is when it flourishes, he argues. But when it pays, and he was writing this like as CCM was ascending, and it was, he said, like, he basically says we should be worried because it's paying us now. And what is the kind of Christianity like? That's not going to be good for us, is his argument, which I think is a really interesting argument. So I'd like to think that I'd be that kind of, think, it's going great. Maybe we should be like, but I don't know. Like, I also do not come from a wealthy background, and if I were in your shoes and I'd be like, gosh, we could use that $500. I like to think that I'd be a person of conscience, but I also don't know for sure, I
mean, no shame. Everybody, hindsight's 2020. But also to your point, like you're asking these questions about, these first experiences that we had with the Audio A guys. And again, I'm not here to talk shit. I'd love to sit down and catch up with them again. We spent so much time with them and other people in the industry as well. But there was a clear disconnect between, the new signings, like the new class of bands that were all getting signed to Tooth and Nail and Flicker Records at the time, that we were not having the same conversation that they were having. Anytime that we were talking to someone or someone was in the room who Christianity had been very beneficial for, we just knew there were some things that they were not going to understand. So it's hard for me to sit here and say, hey, I have these like serious questions about like the ideology that we're propagating and like the sex shaming and the weird stuff that we're experiencing in these like youth groups and youth rooms and with these youth pastors that we're seeing like weekly, and it's all very strange. And then you kind of like, you're sitting across from Toby Mac and he's kind of scratching his head going, yeah, but you just gotta love the Lord. No, it's everything. All of those conversations ended up becoming so reductionist and so like, I don't think you've been thirsty in a minute. Like, I don't think the rubber has met the road for a minute in terms of like when what you believe pays you so handsomely and surrounds you with power and influence and gravitas with all of these people, it disconnects you from the world at large. It insulates you from being able to really understand like what's happening and what we're all experiencing and what it's like for other people. And that I'm not the only person that, that whole class of people, you could look them up. We all kind of have those same sorts of challenges that we faced that sort of shaped our view of like what authority was, what biblical authority was. And just because someone makes a certain amount of money doesn't mean that they have some sort of spiritual insight into the world that is necessary to share with everyone.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great, I think I've heard from so many, I guess alum would be maybe the word of that world. Because it did seem to be like a very particular kind of education.
Yeah.
It's like you're in a school of thought that I think it goes to show the power of the market in evangelicalism. Like that this is, I mean, the first chapter of the book that I've just written about contemporary Christian music, it starts with, I say that like a lot of people tell the story of this movement as the story of rock. But if you look at the business end of it, it actually starts much further back. Yeah. And it starts with this burst of optimism in the early 20th century about the relationship between business and Christianity. And so I think, those conversations that you have reflect that, like 90 years later, I would guess, several generations in.
Yeah.
Where this idea of blending these two, that this is going to be a great idea, that it's going to be for the thriving of Christian communities.
Yeah.
And in the case of CCM, so much of it was domestically focused. So it was about stoking American patriotism and creating ideal American citizens. Like that had been going on, when I'm imagining you at whatever table, having these conversations, you can see how it's kind of a difficult it's a difficult frame to undo. Because especially in that era, it had worked so well. Yeah. You couldn't really have that same conversation now because a lot of what is contemporary Christian music is a much diminished form.
Sure.
Like it's much, much smaller. But at that time, oh, wow. Like good luck arguing with it because it's like, look at how well things are going,
Yeah.
So,
the Lord must be blessing. This is the cattle on 1,000 hill. I mean, we've been given it.
Totally. And, of course, that's not new. That's like a very old idea, especially in America. But when the American economy really took off in the 20th century, I think you see a fascinating like test of that idea. Yeah. And that for the folks who ended up not staying in it for whatever reason, there's lots of different reasons. I hope that this book provides like a way of thinking through that in a larger context. Because I can't imagine, how frustrating that could be when you're in the middle of it. But I hope, that there's a way of looking at it that where you can kind of see like, oh, you can feel the inevitability of this reasoning. Yes. But then also, you can see how ultimately it's not sustainable because essentially the internet and a lot of different things about how evangelicals worship changed. And so it's not the same anymore. I
have to imagine that going through this process of doing all of this research has probably changed you. Like I hope good research does change people or their perspective on things. I would love to know if you feel comfortable sharing. Sure. I'd love to understand a little bit more about your personal connection to this kind of IP in the world. Like I don't identify as a Christian. I can still speak the language. I still understand the subtext. I still have friends that do it. And I have my own reasonings in my own way, but now looking back on my life, it feels inevitable that I could never have stayed. It was always going to be a matter of course that at some point I followed this to its conclusion. And now I can't, once you see, you can't unsee. That's my personal experience. Now you're an assistant professor at a college. You're doing all of this like research, all of this like amazing podcast content. Where do you fall in Christianity on if it were a spectrum within the US, especially after the book?
Thank you. That's a great question. And I have not been asked that yet. I've thought about this a lot lately because because of the book and because toward the end of the book, I write about kind of how CCM reflects the general state of evangelicalism now, and that there are some folks who are sort of kind of middle of the road, general evangelical. Now there are some who are, I would put on the kind of like the politically engaged spectrum, the folks who've kind of sanctified the Trump administration, and that kind of really amped up a version of conservatism.
Yes.
And then, of course, I talk about the evangelical deconstruction crew. And I've thought about like why I don't feel a part of any of those, although I'm quite devout. I'm a Jesus-y type of a gal.
Sure.
And I think two different reasons come to mind. One is being raised in a non-middle class community. I think so many of the consumption patterns that upheld the kind of evangelicalism that CCM came to be the soundtrack of depended on a certain kind of class privilege that I was raised outside of. And because of that, I didn't have the same arc of my life. You know, like we were this small church where we always wanted the resources of the mega church. You know, like that was kind of everyone's dream, was to be like that cool church with the cool whatever. We had none of that.
Yeah.
So that's one part of it. Like I didn't partake in that world. And so it didn't really form me in the same way that I think it did in some ways. People report very positive experiences. Others report really devastating experiences. It just wasn't a part of my life in that way. But then also I would have to say I was raised in like a hippy dippy Pentecostal, very like loosey goosey kind of, you know, people say it as a negative thing, but I love it. The Jesus is my boyfriend kind of stuff. The reason why I don't have distaste for it is as a church historian, a lot of the stuff, like the very like mystical connection with Jesus music, I think it reflects like medieval mystics. So it's an older style of relating to God. But because of that, I did not have the same kind of thing to deconstruct, I think, as a lot of my peers. So it was so like loosey-goosey. It was a flexible faith. And so I think that like my heart really, it's sad to me to see such antipathy in conversations around deconstruction, because I think that like that is a really important process for people to experience, especially in groups that have had such rigid boundaries.
Sure.
So what I'm saying is like, I didn't really go through the deconstruction process because I didn't have like this big brick building to take down. It was sort of like, you know, like, yay, Jesus, you know, like, so people are very critical of that, but and I can't say the same thing for everybody else who I went to church with or anything like that. But I've just been thinking recently, like, what is it that has been sustainable for me? And I think that there's a part of it. My first book I wrote about Amy Semple McPherson, who started the Foursquare Church. And she was this wild, like early 20th century celebrity, very scandalous person who would wear like sequin dresses and had a radio station. And she's just like a fascinating figure. Yeah. And she was my model. And so that is not a mainstream kind of, you know, so, and she just loved, you know, Jesus. So I think maybe that's kind of that's, you know, people haven't asked me a lot about my own personal story, but that's the best rendition of it I can give that speaks to why I am still, like Jesus is still great. I'm happy to bear the label Christian, but I think the other thing is that I'm not in any way put off, scared, angry with, or anything people who've had other experiences. So like I don't have any like, and so I think for some folks, they feel some sort of responsibility to like teach a lesson to, or not Christian. And I'm like, I just don't feel that way. So yeah, I have, you know, I've started developing some social media trolls, because anytime you put yourself out there, especially as a woman on the internet, and someone was like, this is classic deconstruction. And I'm like, oh, little does he know that I go to church every single Sunday. And but I didn't say anything because my own posture is I have no problem with deconstructing people. So
yeah,
I'm like, I'm not even going to go there with you, sir. And it was a sir for sure. But yeah, so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's kind of all I got.
No, I think that's great. And I do think that there's a tone and a spirit about what you've done and the work that you're doing, particularly with the podcast, that feels very kind. It feels like there's a large table to sit at. And it doesn't feel preachy. It doesn't feel like it's like there are conversion tactics being used. It feels a little bit more like a safe place to talk about this really interesting subculture and not place judgment on any of it. Just kind of give the facts in a fun way.
Good.
And I love that about it. Playing the devil's advocate and somebody that used to be in higher ed. For if you were to have an internet troll who was looking at what you were doing and they were to say, give an answer to the best of your ability as to why you can provide clear, objective research about something that you are inside of and a part of in an academic setting.
Well, in scholarly circles, the idea that you can be objective is not seen as there's like trends in research.
Sure.
So, in the past, there's been this idea that you could be entirely objective. And I think if you look to historical work in the past, you can definitely see that that's not possible. So I self-disclose at the very beginning of the book, this is my background. This was my entree into this world.
Right.
And so any historian is doing interpretation of the past. So I'm interpreting something. I can only say that I tried to do inductive research, which is the idea that the method of the book is to say, if you look at the top selling contemporary Christian music over the years, what do you see about evangelicalism? And I treat it as a large scale conversation amongst evangelicals about the kind of world they wanted to create, the kind of young people they wanted to raise, the values they wanted them to have, ideas about politics and the nation. And so then, of course, the back end question of that is, well, what about the groups that didn't make it up to the chart? Sure. And so I do deal a little bit with that. But what I'm trying to do is gather information and then say, like, what conclusions can we come to? There are benefits to having some insider status. For one thing, I knew who Carmen was, a lot of people didn't.
Right.
One of the funniest conversations I've had is telling people who were raised outside that world, like who he was.
Yeah.
You would be surprised. People actually really enjoy him that aren't familiar with him initially because he's very campy. So there are benefits. There are certainly risks to writing with some sort of insider status. And so I think my book, one of the benefits of, some things that help mitigate that risk include it's a thing called blind peer review. So when I wrote the book, the press sends it out to people who I don't know, who are experts in the field, who evaluate, has she proven this point? I guess I wouldn't try to strive for objectivity because I don't think it's possible. I think I would try to strive to do responsible history. Like, am I doing this in a way that is a welcoming, like that I'm taking into account all of the evidence in front of me, that I'm not hiding certain things or, elevating certain things over others and hope for the best. But I'm glad that you felt the kind of openness and hospitality that we were striving toward. We've interviewed people. Some of the people who we've interviewed are still very much a part of the business, that are deeply invested, kind of evangelical media making in many different ways, mostly music. Then there are some folks who had, as you know, they're just absolutely like, we have everything from still really in it, very much like a part of that world, to complete disavowal. I'm no longer a part of it. And we wanted everyone to feel like they were heard, like that we heard them out. And mostly though, we wanted to capture. So we did some kind of market research when we were first starting. One of the things that we did was we interviewed prospective people, and one of the people who we interviewed, you would think based on their experience of life, their social location, their identity, that they would have had like just a pretty traumatic experience with CCM and the world of evangelicalism. And I think they did in some ways, but they said something to us when we were finishing they were like, don't forget the love. There was a lot of love. There was a lot of joy in that world as well. So we're trying to keep both of those things. There's pain in it, and then there's also a lot of joy. And I hope that comes through.
Yeah, I definitely got that vibe. I think you're doing great. High five.
Thanks. We hope so.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was a really fun conversation.
Oh, yeah. Oh, gosh, we've gone overtime.
Oh, it was great.
That's great. Yeah. Thank you so much for being a part of this. And I hope to have you back sometime soon.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Eleventylife is a production of Rock Candy Recordings